Kia ora, and welcome to my Saturday Soliloquy. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. Often I try to summarise what's happened in the week in Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate and poverty. And this one has been a big week in our political economy. You might recall way back in January of this year, the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, came out with a State of the Nation speech in which he said this year was all about going for growth, growth, growth. And his argument was that there were some unbreakable, for sure, laws of economics which the government was abiding by reducing the government's deficit and trying to reduce borrowing and reduce the government's debt curve. And that this would be the strategy to generate growth in the economy, just as it was back in 1991, 1992. Back then, then National Finance Minister Ruth Richardson decided to slash government spending and tighten the government's budget dramatically in order to reduce the government's borrowing then and reduce its foreign debt and avoid a double-notch downgrade by Standard & Poor's. That worked to avoid the double-notch downgrade, although it has, and we now know, created an enormous and awful legacy of poverty, intergenerational poverty, and began a 30 to 40-year period of productivity starving, lack of investment by government and business, which now means we're 30% behind Australia in terms of real wages. But it did, at the time, it was followed by some economic growth. So in 1991-92, the government cut spending, the Reserve Bank cut interest rates, and the economy did surge again through 1992 and 1993. And by the time the government got to the election in 1993, the economy was growing quite strongly again, as much as 7% on average annually. Because the government had stepped back, the household sector had stepped forward, and businesses stepped forward to borrow more and spend and invest. And that's the theory, that as you step back as a government, the households and businesses will step forward. That will generate growth, which helps to reduce the government's deficit. However, that's not happening this time around, and that's because households are much more indebted now than they were in 1991, and also the banks are now much more restricted than they were in 1991. Remember, they were just coming out of decades of very strict controls on their lending, and they were discovering how to become mortgage banks in a serious way. So that's why we're not seeing a rebound. Now, what you're seeing there is a chart, thanks to Shamabil Jakob at Simplicity, showing the orange line, which is the length and depth of the current recession, compared with the one we saw after the global financial crisis. It's already deeper, it's already going to be longer, and at this point, we're not going to see GDP per capita recover to anywhere near the levels it was at the beginning of the recession, at the beginning of 2023, basically. It's going to be 6 or 7 years, and that's longer than we saw during the global financial crisis. This week, the rubber hit the road for the government. That promise of growth, growth, growth turned into a 0.9% contraction in GDP in the June quarter and unleashed a firestorm of criticism from people in the business community, from people on the right of politics, people on the left of politics, even a call from Ruth Richardson and Roger Douglas for Finance Minister Nicola Willis to resign. There you can see, though, Willis said on Thursday that New Zealand's growth had stalled in the June quarter because of Donald Trump's tariff shock on April the 2nd, so-called Liberation Day. That's simply not true. because every other economy in the world had exactly the same shock, but is still growing substantially, including the United States, where you'd think the results would be the most obvious. She said, Trump disrupted my momentum. And that's certainly what she said. It's just not the reason the economy slowed down. Yesterday, Christopher Luxon was forced to essentially promise to support Nicola Willis, describing her as the single New Zealander best placed to be finance minister. I back her. He said. He went on to say that the government's strategy of tightening its belts and reducing the deficit, reducing the debt track, was going to continue full steam ahead. Chris Hipkins, though, hasn't actually called for Nicola Willis to resign. He just said the whole government should resign. And that's where we are at the moment. Just to give you a sense of where we are in the newspapers today. The Herald's leading with a story about school zones. Although, interestingly, the editorial for the New Zealand Herald is for the Reserve Bank to cut the official cash rate dramatically. We have a great cartoon from Rod Emerson about the government being full steam ahead. An interesting little story also today about the IRD quietly being given the power to share its tax details with people. And also today in the Post, you can see there the leaders with Henry Cook questioning the government's claims about economic growth. And also some pretty tough questioning from various commentators about that. RNZ this morning, leading mostly with the rugby, fair enough. There's been plenty on about the economy recently. I'm Bernard Hickey. That's a Saturday Soliloquy in which we've looked at the main news of the week, which was the rubber hitting the road on the government's promise of growth with a contraction in the June quarter because of its own policies and it being determined to carry on with those policies. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a Saturday Soliloquy for the week to Saturday, September the 20th. Ka kite anō.